All right, so welcome. I'm very impressed that all of you have come out to Stanford the day before spring break is due to begin. So thank you for coming. My name is Frank Fujiyama. I am the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which is part of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies here at Stanford University. All of the people on this panel, by some strange coincidence, are all good friends of mine and related to activities that I've been engaged in for a long time. One of those is the American Interest magazine, which, if you're not familiar with it, is one of the, I think, best, most kind of empirically based and reasonable journals dealing with all of the big public policy issues that affect not just America, but countries around the world and the way that they see America and interact with it. The speakers, actually, we're starting with you, Charles, so we're actually sitting in the wrong order, but that's all right. So Charles Davidson is the publisher of the American Interest. Yeah, you can switch. He is a senior policy fellow at the Schar School of Policy and Government now at George Mason University. Since 2006, he was the co-founder of Global Financial Integrity and was one of the founders of the FACT Coalition, executive producer of the Sundance documentary We're Not Broke, and until recently executive director of the Kleptocracy initiative at the Hudson Institute, which has simply moved to George Mason, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, more or less. So the Kleptocracy initiative, if you have followed it, has published a whole series of reports looking at the threat that is posed by kleptocracy, not just in Russia, but in many other countries around the world. And it has sponsored a number of klepto tours of London, the premiere of From Russia with Cash in Washington, the dubbing of a Russian documentary explaining Putin's rise to power, the establishment of an extensive archive of primary source material, hosting many events, and serving as a platform for anti-kleptocracy convening and information sharing. Dr. Jeffrey Gedmin is the new editor-in-chief of the American Interest. From 2015 to 18, he was a senior advisor at Blue Star Strategies. From 2011 to 14, Gedmin was the president and CEO of the London-based Legatum Institute that publishes, among other things, a yearly statistical or kind of series of measures of governance quality. Before that, he served for 4 years as president and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague. He was president and CEO of the Aspen Institute in Berlin, and prior to that, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and director of the New Atlantic Initiative. Sasha Oleksandra Ustinova is this year a fellow at our Ukrainian Emerging Leaders program, which is a program that brings every year 3 up-and-coming mid-career Ukrainians to Stanford University for the academic year. She was head of communications and anti-corruption in healthcare projects at the Anti-Corruption Action Center, ANTAC, in Kiev, Ukraine. That organization is one of the leading watchdog organizations on anti-corruption reform in Ukraine, and one of the founders of the new anti-corruption institutes there. She's served as a communication and advocacy expert over the last 10 years and has been a tireless advocate for reforms to that country's anti-corruption institutions. So we are all extremely pleased to have them speaking to us today. So we will go in the order in which they're seated. Each of you has 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for discussion. So Charles, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Frank, and it's a pleasure being here. I should first indicate what provoked my interest in kleptocracy. And some of us may recall when Putin was in the process of not invading Crimea. And it occurred to me that this is crazy. He and his cronies and the ruling clique have all these resources in the West that we're safeguarding for them. And we have this huge leverage over this man and this regime that we're not using, that the policy world in Washington, D.C. is essentially not aware of. And this just struck me as being a rather pathetic situation. So I thought this needed to be explained and brought to awareness of policy people in Washington and to our government and to a broader public, which is why we did this huge variety of activities. And the idea was to infect as many other people as possible with the notion we were trying to promote. So that's how it started. But we're at a university, so why don't we jump right into kleptocracy as a political system, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, we're covering both Russia and Ukraine today, which are two very different situations. I'll just talk about Russia and about kleptocracy more broadly. And I would posit that kleptocracy as it exists in 2019 and what we've seen build over the last few years may actually be something new in terms of political business models. It's a new sort of regime. So let's just look at what the structure of this is and in very simple terms. And obviously Russia is a prime illustration of this, but there are many other countries that fit the same model. So kleptocracy means rule by thieves. We have that in place. But what's different about 2019 kleptocracy from a simple situation of rule by thieves? Well, there are really two elements. One is that we could very, very well start by talking about authoritarianism rather than kleptocracy, because all the authoritarian regimes that are putting pressure on us are structured as kleptocracies. And then these kleptocratic regimes are all built on a model where we are integral to their functioning, because the looters, the kleptos, loot their country and then they stock the loot with us. We provide the stash, we provide the fencing, all of these services to current day kleptocrats. So we're very much part of the system. And again, I could say current day kleptocrats, or I could say current day authoritarianism. So we've got this extremely powerful coupling of these two notions, neither of which is particularly friendly to our way of seeing things. And one of the things in the title of this gathering today is the notion of our institutions and how, as I would put it, do they enable or facilitate this system. And I think right now that should be also the emphasis in terms of our policy, because there are a lot of things that are going on, and we have sanctions in place since Putin was not invading Crimea. Now the word kleptocracy has become so well known that my daughter actually found a prefabricated mug with the word kleptocracy on it that was part of my Christmas present this year. So that's out there. We're doing sanctions, we're doing all sorts of things, but what we have not confronted yet is our role as part of the system, as part of the enabling of this whole system. And I probably don't need to say too much about that, because this has been so much in the news about how our law firms are involved with this, PR firms, financial firms, et cetera. I mean, in terms of how this is taking place, there's some outrageous things, such as the fact that private equity and hedge funds don't need to reveal anything at all about who their clients are. So there are these huge loopholes in terms of our laws and how we are penetrated by all of this. But that's Russia. Big country. If we look at other countries that are operating with a fairly pure kleptocratic model, such as I described, we could talk about Azerbaijan, certainly, that follows that. And again, they're doing, they are really using our enabling industry with a great deal of skill. I mean, the way they're buying people in Washington is quite breathtaking. And there are all sorts of other countries that fit this model, of course. So that's sort of framing things. Is that about right in length,
No.
Frank? And then I think we'll move on, and I'm particularly looking forward to the to questions later.
Good. Frank, thank you, and Charles, thank you. I'm I'm the interloper on this panel because of principally because of Frank's generosity and hospitality. I'm not an expert on kleptocracy. Fortunately for me, I'm not a kleptocrat, so I'm not going to be hunted by Charles Davidson. But I have some thoughts, and I'll share them briefly, and in the form, in part, of response to what I heard from Charles, and maybe building a bridge to what Sasha's going to tell us, because these two colleagues are true experts. First, a very brief story, and then to a few remarks. When East Germany, communist East Germany, collapsed, it's 30 years now since the fall of the Berlin Wall in November. And when communism collapsed in East Germany and the archives opened and West German and other researchers went in to look at how the regime operated and maintained control, and we saw the extensive surveillance network that the East German secret police had, the Stasi. There was one document that had a turn of phrase which I thought was so striking. It was a Stasi case officer reporting to his superior about the network of informers. And if you know, or if you recall, in communist East Germany, a country of about 17 million people, 1 out of 8 people were on the books as an informer. And if that isn't vivid enough for you, imagine what that means. That means that practically speaking, every classroom, every bus stop, every church, every office, every bar or restaurant, there was at least one person watching, listening, reporting, and you have to imagine what unbelievable effect and damage that had on society, on families, on relationships, and so on. To the point, a Stasi case officer reporting to his superior said, the network of informers worked so brilliantly, he said, they are the little red lanterns that keep our empire alive and working. What a sinister and cynical thing to say. Every authoritarian regime, because per definition, they do not govern by consent. So whatever the stripe, every authoritarian regime has its method of defending its power and surveilling and manipulating and controlling the citizenry. And it seems to me lots has changed. Some things haven't changed, but a number of things have changed for a number of reasons, including technology. But today, if you look at a country like Russia, and Vladimir Putin, as you know, may be many things, but he is a man of the culture of the KGB. He came of age professionally as a young KGB man in Eastern Germany, in Dresden. He smells this, breathes it, sleeps it. It's an art and science that we have trouble, I think, comprehending in free Western societies. Has proved very adaptable. And as Russia has evolved and his thinking about authoritarian rule has evolved, they still have a secret police, and they still have informers, and they still have surveillance, but they have this thing that Charles is talking about, which is a kleptocratic system and culture that has different aspects to it. I find when I talk to people about this, they say, oh, corruption, I know that's everywhere. We have corruption in Washington too, but this is something different. This isn't individuals who are greedy and who are stealing, and it's that too, but it's a system and culture that allows a regime to defend its power and maintain its rule. Point one. Point two, as Charles said, how odd and ironic and alarming it is that if you get your head around it and work as he does on these subjects, and Sasha, they can't do it without us. They steal in shorthand, and they have to have places to hide it from their own citizens, principally, and enter Western institutions, banks, lobbying firms, consulting firms, law firms that play all sorts of roles in all sorts of different ways, kind of the rope with which we will hang ourselves. That's the second point. The third point and the last point I want to make, which I would like to hear more from Sasha about, is it's not just, however, authoritarian regimes that are kleptocratic in this very unfortunate and alarming way. And I think it's important to make some distinctions, and I think we're about to hear from Sasha about Ukraine. And so people in Washington, in my circles, will say, it's all the same. Russian oligarchs and kleptocrats, Ukrainian oligarchs and kleptocrats, I'm just done with it. Why do we have any time with any of that? And I'd only like to suggest, well, none of it is good, and all of it is problematic. But in one case, you have kleptocrats who are uniformly aligned with the regime. That's Vladimir Putin's Russia. Ask Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia, who went to jail for 10 years. Number two, I think that, Sasha, you'll correct me, in Ukraine, I'm going to suggest it's all problematic, but there's a mix of methods about how wealth was acquired, and not in all cases by all individuals stolen, if I may say. But last but not least, fundamentally, centrally and strategically, there are some countries like Ukraine which, at least aspirationally, would like to join the West. Oh, that's just rhetoric. That's not bad. Okay? The aspiration to join the European Union, the aspiration to be a member of NATO, aspiration to be a democracy, however flawed and however problematic. And when you have a country like Vladimir Putin's Russia, at least we don't have to doubt when we go to bed at night. That's an adversarial country that is invested in our failure, that seeks to build this Russia up by cutting us down. So all to say, detail is important, context maybe even more so, and thank you. That's my job as interloper, to respond to Charles and hopefully build a little bit of a bridge to Sasha.
Okay, so Sasha has some slides, so I think we should probably move down.
I think so then. Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure and honor to present today about the Ukrainian situation, and thank you so much for bridging it to my speech, because yes, Ukraine is a bit different, even in kleptocratic sense, from Russia. We had never been a real autocracy. Well, we were this close during Yanukovych regime, but you know, we always had this competition even between our oligarchs for the same natural resources, the same money. And the other thing is, Ukraine had never been so rich in natural resources as Russia, for example. We are rich, but we are not that rich as Russia. So it had been different, and I'm going to give you a little bit overview of what our kleptocrats look like. But there is one thing that I want to mention and to focus on. None of the crooks, whether from Ukraine, Russia, or any other country, want to keep their money in their own countries. They all want to keep their money abroad, in Western democracies, hidden under the shell companies, transferred through the international banks. And even if you look up the registries here in the United States, in Malibu, or let's say Beverly Hills or Manhattan, the majority, like not the majority, but a lot of the real estate property belongs to somebody from Ukraine, from Russia, or from other states, and they are normally registered to the shell companies, not to the real beneficial owners. So I just wanted to give you a few examples of what our Ukrainian oligarchs own. So the London metro station owner is a Ukrainian oligarch, Dmitry Firtash. He's right now under the FBI investigation. He is in Austria, and he's waiting to be extradited here to the United States. The second Ukrainian oligarch owns one of the most expensive apartments in the world. It's not somebody from Saudi Arabia, you might think. Yeah, it's not a sheikh, it's a Ukrainian oligarch. And he's actually a former parliamentarian. He was a very close ally to the escaped president, to Yanukovych, who flew to Russia after the Revolution of Dignity. But you know what? He still kept his assets, and they're growing even nowadays after his close ally Yanukovych escaped to Russia. And that's the difference in Russia and Ukraine as well, I would say. They're all adaptable. They can always negotiate and find the way to adapt to the new ruling party or to the new president. So when Yanukovych escaped, by the way, Ukraine was almost bankrupt. Ukraine had $12,000 on its bank accounts. When his allies were buying expensive properties, like the most expensive properties in the, not even in London, but in the world. And this is one of the mansions here, not far from San Francisco. It's an 18 square foot mansion, which is considered to be the biggest one in Marin County. It belongs to our former Prime Minister, Pavlo Lazarenko. He ended up here in jail. He was supposed to spend 15 years, but it ended up spending 9 years in jail here in California. He is now out of the jail, having a great time here with his kids in California. And Ukrainian, Swiss, and US prosecutors are still trying to get back almost $250 million allocated in his accounts in different countries. It's 17 countries. It's Liechtenstein, Lithuania, it's Antigua, and even the Swiss banks. So the person could afford to buy a mansion. Actually, Eddie Murphy used to stay in this mansion as well, when the average salary in the country was around $200 per month. So when you look at all these mansions and all these expensive properties, you might think that Ukraine is a country of opportunities, right? Because how come you can become so rich? Well, you can, especially if you have access to the state budget, to public funds, and and you're close to the political elites. But one thing this could be impossible without is international actors. He was buying this property with the shell companies that was registered to another person. All the transfers were done through the American banks, and just because you could hide who the beneficial owner is, and you could hide behind the shell company, it was so easy back then and even now to hide who the real owner of this property is. Ukraine today was on the 120th place in corruption perception index out of 180 countries. And that's actually, and this is sad because Ukraine had the biggest chances to be successful after the USSR collapsed. But just because the privatization failed, and for you to understand the majority of Ukrainian oligarchs, when we say oligarch, we don't mean people who made their money in business. The majority of Ukrainian oligarchs made their money back in mafia, in clans, in the 90s. For example, Akhmetov, who is the owner of the most expensive apartment in the world, he comes from Donetsk clan, and his business partner was blown up by a bomb watching the soccer game. That he was the president of the soccer club, and he was actually murdered at the stadium. After that, Akhmetov became the president of the same soccer club, and he's still till today. So that's how you made your career or your money back in the 90s. But after you actually gained all that wealth, you had to invest it somewhere. And first, they invested in Ukrainian political elite. So they either became parliamentarians themselves, or they invested in somebody running for the parliament. And later to the people who were actually governors and close to the executive boards. But the second two steps are very interesting. Then they started investing in business abroad. And the third step was washing off their reputation abroad, especially using different philanthropic funds and international PR lobbying firms that Charles was mentioning before, and even the think tanks here in DC. So Yanukovych actually was one of the of the biggest investor in the lobbyist firms here in Washington, DC. One of the firms he invested in was called Podesta Group. It was run by the former chief of staff of Clinton administration, and he invested more than $1 million to wash off the reputation of the party of region and to show that everything was going okay in Ukraine and it was not turning into autocracy. Or the second group he was investing in was Mercury, Clegg, and Weinstock. And it was all invested not directly from Yanukovych. There was a special company created in Brussels. It was a charitable fund with the budget, with a 10,000 euro budget per month. Per year, that invested more than $1.5 million within 2 years into the lobbying firm in DC just to wash off the party of region's reputations. And you know, not a lot has changed after the Revolution of Dignity. I'll just give you an example. Akhmetov, the guy who blew up, who actually became the president of the soccer club after his business partner was blew up by a bomb, and who owns the most expensive apartment in the world. He is now investing in one of the top American think tanks called Atlantic Councils. So his core company is called System Capital Management, and they had recently invested, I don't know, it's whether a quarter or $500,000 to the Atlantic Council, which is a very respectable think tank here in DC. Or I'll give you another example. This is Mykola Zlochevsky. It's our former Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources. He actually flew away from the country after the Revolution of Dignity. He escaped, and he was even sanctioned in the United Kingdom. He was anti-sanctions, but he got away because our General Prosecutor's Office helped him. But the reason I'm showing it is because it's a really interesting story of how from an odious escaped minister you become a very respectful businessman abroad just in a few years, even here in DC. So Mykola Zlochevsky owns 38 permits for gas and oil development and extractions in Ukraine, and this is the largest number of the permits owned by one man in our country. Actually, 30% of all the oil and gas permits are owned by people that are in power. You can see here Mykola Zlochevsky, former Minister of Ecology. You can see here Viktor Pinchuk, who is the son-in-law of the former president of Ukraine, or Oleksandra Ustinova, who is now hiding in London from law enforcement. He is still a member of the Ukrainian parliament. So all these people owe almost 30% of all the permits in Ukraine, but let's go back to Zlochevsky. So Zlochevsky actually got, for example, Joe Biden's son, Hunter, on board of his main company called Burisma Holding. And later he invested money and he signed a contract with Atlantic Council.